When people talk about legendary engines, they usually point to speed, power, or racing trophies. But the Ford 300 Inline-6 earned its reputation by doing the opposite. It didn't chase performance headlines or dominate spec sheets. Instead, it quietly became an anomaly. An engine that looked outdated the day it was born, yet refused to disappear no matter how many times the industry tried to move on. By every modern standard, the Ford 300 should have failed. It was heavy, it was simple, it lacked the glamour of V8s and the efficiency hype of newer designs. And yet, while flashier engines came and went, this unassuming inline-6 survived oil crises, emissions crackdowns, and decades of corporate reinvention. Mechanics didn't praise it because Ford told them to. Farmers didn't trust it because of advertising. Fleet managers didn't keep it alive out of nostalgia. They relied on it because it worked, day after day, year after year, often in conditions that destroyed more advanced engines. High mileage wasn't an exception, it was the expectation. That's what makes this engine different. It wasn't built to be remembered, it was built to endure. Somewhere along the way, that endurance turned into something close to legend, passed down through workshops, job sites, and back roads rather than brochures. The real mystery isn't why people loved the Ford 300. It's why Ford itself kept trying to replace it. Again and again, newer engines arrived, promising progress and efficiency. And again, they failed to earn trust. Because this engine didn't survive by being better on paper, it survived. When the Ford 300 Inline-6 was conceived, America was a very different place. Trucks were not lifestyle accessories or status symbols. They were tools, bought by farmers, contractors, and small businesses that depended on them to work every single day. Ford understood this reality, and the 300 was engineered to serve it. Its design philosophy was simple by intention, not by limitation. The long inline layout allowed generous bearing surfaces, thick castings, and wide tolerances that favoured durability over refinement. The long-stroke configuration prioritised low-end torque, the kind needed to pull loads, climb grades, and idle for hours without complaint. Horsepower numbers were secondary, reliability was the mission. Inline-6 architecture also made sense for the America Ford was building for. It was easier to service, easier to access, and more forgiving when maintenance was delayed. In rural areas and job sites, simplicity wasn't a drawback, it was survival. This engine was meant to be fixed with basic tools, not precision diagnostics. At the same time, a different philosophy was taking hold elsewhere in the industry. High-output V8s were becoming symbols of progress and performance, dominating marketing and culture. Speed, sound, and spectacle mattered more than longevity. The Ford 300 stood apart from that movement, quietly optimized for work rather than excitement. That contrast would define its future. While other engines chased innovation and image, the 300 remained anchored to function. It wasn't designed to impress magazines or win comparisons. It was designed to start every morning, carry the load, and come back the next day. And that stubborn focus, rooted in a different America, would eventually make it impossible to ignore. In doing so, it preserved a philosophy of engineering that valued trust over trends, function over fashion, and durability over promises, long after the industry moved on without apology ever. This is where the Ford 300 Inline-6 stopped being an engineering idea and became a reputation. Out in the real world, this engine was worked hard, neglected often, and expected to perform anyway. It lived in farm trucks that idled all day, fleet vehicles that never rested, and workhorses that crossed mileage numbers most engines never see. Oil changes were delayed, coolant was ignored, loads were heavier than recommended, and still the 300 kept running. Not because it was treated gently, but because it was built to tolerate abuse. Mechanics noticed a pattern early on. These engines didn't come in for catastrophic failures. They came in for everything else around them wearing out first. That pattern repeated everywhere. Fleet managers trusted it because downtime was rare. Farmers refused to give it up because it always started. Independent mechanics respected it because it forgave mistakes that would kill more advanced engines. Over time, those shared experiences created something stronger than marketing: trust. The engine gained a reputation for being boring, and that was exactly the point. It didn't surprise anyone. It didn't demand attention. It simply did its job, over and over, without drama. But that reliability had a side effect. When an engine never fails, people resist replacing it. Newer powertrains arrived with better numbers and cleaner emissions, but they couldn't erase lived experience. The Ford 300 wasn't just working well, it was refusing to leave. And that refusal would eventually put it in conflict with the company that built it. As the Ford 300 Inline 6 built an almost unbreakable reputation in the real world, it quietly became a problem inside Ford itself. The industry was changing, and durability alone was no longer the primary metric executives were rewarded for. Emissions regulations tightened, fuel economy targets grew stricter, weight, packaging, and efficiency became boardroom priorities. On paper, the 300 looked like a relic. Its heavy cast-iron construction worked against modern efficiency goals. Its long inline layouts complicated crash standards and engine bay design. From a corporate perspective, it made sense to move on. Newer engines promised cleaner emissions, better mileage, and more flexibility across platforms. But those promises clashed with reality. Engineers could design replacements that met regulations, yet customers didn't trust them the same way. Fleet buyers complained. Farmers held on to older trucks. Mechanics quietly warned owners away from upgrades that hadn't proven themselves. What looked like progress internally felt like regression in the field. This created an unusual tension. Ford wasn't trying to abandon its customers. It was trying to survive a changing industry. Yet every attempt to phase out the 300 exposed the same contradiction. New engines were more advanced, but they weren't more dependable. They improved spreadsheets, not confidence. Over time, the 300 Inline 6 became something no corporation wants on its balance sheet: irreplaceable. Its reliability slowed adoption of newer platforms and complicated long-term planning. The engine that had once been a solution was now an obstacle. And despite multiple attempts to push past it, the question remained unanswered. If this engine was truly obsolete, why did nothing else earn the same trust? That unresolved tension lingered for years, quietly shaping decisions, frustrating planners, and delaying change, until forces far beyond loyalty or engineering finally made the decision unavoidable for everyone involved at every level of the company. What made the Ford 300 Inline 6 truly unkillable wasn't one magical feature, but a rare balance modern engines rarely achieve. Everything about it operated inside safe margins. Torque arrived low and stayed consistent, reducing stress on internal components while delivering exactly what trucks needed. Nothing was pushed to extremes, and that restraint became its advantage. The long-stroke design spread loads evenly across the crankshaft, while the inline layout reduced vibration and complexity. Thick cast-iron blocks absorbed heat and resisted warping, giving the engine exceptional thermal stability under sustained load. Where newer engines chased lighter materials and tighter tolerances, the 300 thrived on generosity, Extra metal, extra clearance, extra forgiveness. Those tolerances mattered. Bearings weren't operating at the edge of failure. Cooling systems had a margin. Oil passages were uncomplicated and resilient. Even when maintenance slipped, the engine stayed within operating limits. It didn't rely on perfect conditions to survive. This overbuilt nature wasn't intentional brilliance. It was a byproduct of conservative engineering in an era before extreme optimization. Yet that conservatism created something modern engines struggle to replicate. As designs evolved toward efficiency and emissions compliance, safety margins shrank. Performance improved, but resilience quietly declined. In real-world conditions, the Ford 300 began to outperform newer engines where it mattered most. It pulled longer, ran hotter, idled longer, and tolerated abuse better. It didn't win drag races, it won workdays. In fleets, on farms, and on job sites, it proved that consistency beats capability. This was the turning point. The engine was no longer just surviving despite progress. It was succeeding because of what progress removed. Modern engines were impressive. The 300 was dependable. That distinction explains why it became unkillable. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. It delivered exactly what it promised, never more, never less. And in environments where failure had consequences, that honesty mattered more than innovation ever could. That is why, decades later, its reputation still outweighs newer technology, reminding engineers that durability is not accidental. It is designed and proven under pressure over time, repeatedly. By the time the Ford 300 Inline 6 reached its final years, it wasn't failing customers. It was failing the future it was being forced into. The automotive world had shifted toward metrics the engine was never designed to satisfy, and no amount of loyalty could stop that change. Emissions regulations grew increasingly complex, demanding precise fuel control, tighter combustion management, and advanced electronics. The 300's simplicity, once its greatest strength, became a liability. Its heavy cast-iron construction struggled against weight targets. Its long inline layout conflicted with modern crash standards and tighter engine bays. Efficiency was now measured in spreadsheets, not service life. At the same time, manufacturing economics changed. Automakers needed engines that could be shared across platforms, scaled globally, and optimized for cost as much as durability. The 300 was stubbornly singular. It excelled in trucks, but fit nowhere else. In a data-driven industry, specialization became inefficiency. None of this meant the engine had suddenly become bad. In fact, it was still doing exactly what it always had. But the definition of success had moved. Longevity no longer outweighed emissions compliance. Reliability no longer excused excess weight or packaging complexity. Progress demanded compromises the 300 was never meant to make. So its end came quietly. No dramatic failure, no recall, no scandal, just a gradual disappearance as regulations tightened and new architectures took over. The engine didn't lose a battle. It outlived the war it was built for. What remained was a legacy shaped by inevitability. The Ford 300 Inline 6 didn't die because it was flawed. It ended because the world stopped rewarding what it did best, leaving behind a standard few modern engines still managed to reach. That quiet ending made its absence louder, forcing comparisons every time newer engines promised progress, without earning trust fully again. The Ford 300 Inline 6 was never meant to be remembered. It was designed to work, to endure, and to disappear quietly into the background of American life. Yet that is exactly why its legacy matters. This engine represents a philosophy modern engineering often struggles to defend. It valued margin over optimization, trust over novelty, and longevity over impressive first impressions. It proved that progress is not always measured by what is newest, lightest, or most complex, but by what continues to perform when conditions are unforgiving and expectations are high. For decades, the 300 became an unspoken benchmark. New engines arrived with better numbers, cleaner emissions, and smarter systems. Yet they were still judged against an old inline 6 built in a different era. Mechanics asked whether they would last. Owners asked whether they would survive neglect. Fleets asked whether downtime would increase. Those questions existed because the Ford 300 had already answered them. Its absence revealed what it once provided. When it was gone, reliability became a selling point instead of an assumption. Durability became a feature instead of a foundation. The engine didn't just power trucks, it shaped expectations. The Ford 300 Inline 6 refused to die because it never chased trends. It served a purpose, honestly, until the world around it changed. And in that quiet resistance, it left behind a standard few engines still reach. Remembering it isn't about nostalgia. It's about recognizing that some machines succeed not by evolving constantly, but by being right from the start. Its story invites viewers to question how many other unkillable designs were abandoned, not because they failed, but because priorities quietly shifted elsewhere over time.